Good evening. My name's James. I'm one of the house managers here. On behalf of the staff at Town Hall Seattle, it's my pleasure to welcome you to tonight's presentation featuring cutting-edge research by UW students Kaylin Ellioff, Samantha Borje, and Sonya Jampel. This is the third of 5 events in the UW Engage Science series, and we're so pleased to be able to once again offer this platform for these students and their important and engaging work. As we get underway, I would like to acknowledge our institution stands on the unceded traditional territory of the Coast Salish people, particularly the Duwamish. We thank them for our continuing use of the natural resources of their ancestral homeland. Town Hall is adding new events and podcasts every day. Visit our website to view our calendar of upcoming events and sign up for our e-newsletter to receive updates as future events are added this season. Town Hall's work is made possible through your support and the support of our sponsors. As part of our Arno G. Matulski Science Lecture Series, this event is supported by Microsoft. Now please welcome Nicole Gregorio to the stage.
All right. Hi, everyone. I forgot to print my notes tonight, so they're on my phone. Sorry about that. Thank you all so much for coming. Last winter, I was very honored to be able to be the instructor for our Engage Science Communication course. This is a course run by a group of graduate students at the University of Washington called Engage, and we really try to prepare a group of amazing graduate students with the skills that they need to communicate about their work with the general audience. We really hope to improve science communication education at the University of Washington, and we envision a future where scientists more freely and effectively communicate about their work with the public. So tonight, 3 of our incredible students from the course are here to tell you about their graduate work. Their talks represent real research happening at the University of Washington right now, so we hope you enjoy this unique opportunity to get a behind-the-scenes look at it. So without further ado, let me introduce our first speaker. Our first speaker is Kaylin Ellioff. She is a pharmacology graduate student at the University of Washington, where she studies different chemicals found in cannabis and how they can be used to treat chronic pain. By better understanding how each of the chemicals work in our body, she hopes that we can identify new treatments for chronic pain. So please welcome to the stage, Kaylin.
All right, awesome. It is a pleasure to be here, and I am so excited to tell you a little bit about kind of the background on the work I'm working on, and then towards the end a little bit about, why it's important, and yeah, I'll just jump right in. So to start, I want you all to close your eyes. Close your eyes and touch something near you. So the side of your chair, the back of your hand. And what does it feel like? What's the texture? Is it smooth? Is it rough? What about the temperature? Is it warm, cool? And how hard are you pressing? Are you pressing firmly, lightly? You can open your eyes, and it's not often we can take the time to really appreciate and feel this rich combination of sensory information that's around us all the time. But how on earth do the tips of our fingers communicate that complex information all the way back to our brain so we can feel these different sensations? And our body is made up of trillions of cells, and they are all covered by these special sensors called receptors. And you can think of receptors like locks on a door. And the things that receptors respond to, so light, cold, warmth, pressure, those trigger the keys to unlock the locks. And many of these kinds of receptors are found on places like our eyes, skin, muscles, etc. And when the key activates the lock, this can trigger chemicals to release, which then can act as a trigger for other receptors found deeper inside our bodies and brain. And so if we look at the sensation of pain, pain receptors are called nociceptors, and they are designed to respond to pain specifically. So they cover our skin, and in this case, an injury would activate the receptor. So if you stub your toe, these receptors get activated, and chemicals are released inside of our body. And then those can go and activate chemicals inside of our brain, which then, all in all, makes us perceive the sensation of pain. And so while pain is a completely normal and necessary response to injury, chronic pain is a different situation. Chronic pain lasts for more than 3 months and can be caused by a variety of factors. And chronic pain affects more Americans than heart disease, diabetes, and cancer all combined, which kind of makes sense because a lot of these conditions, chronic pain is also involved. And so that boils down to 1 in 5 people sitting in this room either currently experiencing or will one day experience chronic pain, which is a lot of people. And living with this kind of pain on a day-to-day basis is difficult, as you might imagine. Went too fast. And it's not really the kind of thing that you can just avoid. So I guess to give an example, if you get a sunburn, any slight touch to your skin kind of hurts after that. So if you take a shower or put on a shirt, those things hurt a lot. And this is often the case in people experiencing chronic pain, and not saying it's always going to be like a sunburn, but they can't avoid the triggers that would cause their chronic pain. And in a lot of cases, there's not a clear source of where the pain is coming from. And so this is why people experiencing chronic pain have restrictions in their daily activities, reduced quality of life, depression, anxiety, and in a lot of severe cases, opioids are prescribed, which in a subset of people can lead to things like opioid dependence. And I do want to give some context on the opioid epidemic because of this. And although there are many different opioid drugs that can be prescribed, the one that kind of sticks out in my mind, and many of you may have heard of it, is the story of OxyContin. So to give context, OxyContin is a prescription opioid painkiller that was first introduced in the US around 1995 by the company Purdue Pharma. And its active ingredient is oxycodone, which is a very highly potent pain reliever. And so this is how they marketed the drug, as this revolutionary new treatment for those that have chronic pain. And so what is important to note is the way that they marketed it is safe and effective, and they didn't necessarily inform the public about the different side effects that could happen. And so oxycodone, as we now know, has a lot of side effects, which are listed up here. So drowsiness, dizziness, nausea, constipation, respiratory depression, and in cases of overdose can lead to coma and death. And so additionally, it's really only effective for acute pain situations. Our bodies are very quickly become tolerant to these drugs, so people will need a higher and higher dose over time to get the same pain relieving effects, which is not ideal. And so over time, the overprescription of this drug for conditions like chronic pain has led to this kind of epidemic of opioid addiction and overdose deaths in the US. And so this right here is looking at the rate of overdose deaths, specifically in King County. And we can see that, starting around the time that oxycodone was introduced, we see this kind of steady incline over time. And this is showing up until 2009. But in 2007, the manufacturer of OxyContin, again, Purdue Pharma, pleaded guilty to charges of misleading the public about the drug's risk and has agreed to pay some $600 million fines. But public perception about the issue really started changing around not until 2009, as emergency departments were more full than ever with overdose patients. And so moving forward, 2016 was a very pivotal time. It's when the FDA finally required strong warnings for analgesics on the bottle, which was a huge win. And since then, there has been a really concerted effort to address the opioid epidemic through a range of measures. So this is improved prescribing guidelines, increased access to treatment, and expanded access to overdose reversing medications like naloxone. And so OxyContin is still available by prescription, but it's typically reserved for those experiencing severe pain. But again, we need alternative treatments besides these opioids to treat chronic pain. And these treatments would not only alleviate suffering and allow people to perform their daily activities without side effects that are present even when they're taking opioids, but also reduce the risk of people potentially becoming dependent on opioids. And so why don't we already have better treatments? We're in the 21st century. Chronic pain, long story short, it's complicated. So chronic pain is a super difficult condition to treat because it manifests differently in everyone. There are many different kinds of chronic pain, and all of the pathways associated with chronic pain are kind of different depending what kind of pain you're talking about. But what we do know is that pain can involve changes to our pain pathway that make it more sensitive and reactive. But, where the heck do we start? So to figure that out, let me tell you a story about a Scottish woman named Joanna Cameron. So Joanna, or Jo for short, thought she was living a perfectly normal life until she turned 66. So she was in the hospital about to undergo what is normally an incredibly painful arthritis surgery for her severe arthritis. And before the surgery, she casually mentions to her doctor that she doesn't actually need any anesthesia. Like, what? So not believing her, the doctor gave her anesthesia as usual, but decided to follow up with her after the surgery. And Jo reported that she didn't take any of her prescribed painkillers, and that she hadn't taken painkillers for her previous arthritis diagnosis, her hip replacement surgery, and during the birth of her 2 children, she described the whole experience as a bit uncomfortable. And so looking back even further, she had never really noticed injuries. So her mom would notice she broke her arm and didn't notice until her mom pointed it out. She would often smell her skin burning before realizing. And, what about Jo made her unable to sense pain in this way? So it turns out Jo had some differences in the way that her body makes an enzyme called Pha. And you can think of Pha like Pac-Man, which acts to break down another chemical in our body called anandamide. And so after doing some genetic testing, it turns out Jo's body does not make Pha. And so when you take out Pha, you have more anandamide floating around. And so Jo had more anandamide in her brain and body compared to the average person. And we know from rodent studies that mice that also don't have Pha have kind of a similar pain perception to that of Jo. And so, it goes to reason, what is anandamide? And it turns out anandamide is a super important player in a system in our body called the endocannabinoid system. And within this system, there are 3 main components that are important. The receptors, CB1 and CB2, which are found all over the body as shown in the diagram on the left. Endocannabinoids, so this is anandamide, and another one called 2-AG. And the reason that they're called endocannabinoids is because endo means within, and it means that they're produced within our own bodies. And then lastly, different enzymes such as Pha and MEG lipase. And so as a whole, the endocannabinoid system is really important for maintaining balance within our bodies. And so it regulates pain perception, mood, sleep, immune function, appetite. And it basically, if something gets out of whack, the endocannabinoid system is there to restore the balance. And so if we go back and talk some more about anandamide, it's kind of been nicknamed the bliss molecule. And it's more complicated than that, but generally speaking, anandamide has an important role to play in pain perception and mood regulation. And thinking back to Jo's story, she not only didn't sense pain the same way that we normally would, but she also had reduced stress and didn't experience fear like the average person as well. And so anandamide, what it does is it acts as a key to activate CB1 receptors. And so it turns out that a chemical found in cannabis or marijuana called THC also acts at the same receptor. And so THC is what we would call a phytocannabinoid, which means that it's derived from plants, versus anandamide is an endocannabinoid, which means our body makes it naturally. And so not only does Joe's story kind of provide us this good rationale for why the endocannabinoid system might be important, but we also know that cannabis has been used for centuries, since 2737 BC, to treat a variety of pain conditions. So I guess why not just use cannabis? Well, THC is one of the main components, as I mentioned, and it is actually what is responsible for the psychoactive components of cannabis. So it is responsible when it binds at the CB1 receptor for the feelings of being high. And people experiencing chronic pain don't necessarily want to be high every day to have pain relief. And I know what you're thinking, why doesn't anandamide cause you to be high if it's acting at the same receptor? It's a little less potent than THC. It doesn't bind as tightly to that receptor. And also it's degraded much quicker, I guess, in our bodies. But if we don't want people, if people don't want to be high to experience pain relief, what other chemicals are present in cannabis, and do those have pain relieving qualities? CBD is a super attractive option. We know that CBD is also present in high levels in cannabis and doesn't have the same psychoactive effects as THC. And research is still in progress, but there have been a lot of studies that have shown that CBD does have pain-relieving qualities and anti-inflammatory properties. But it's a little less clear which receptors in our bodies that CBD acts on. And it has been shown already to have many targets all over our body. And so what else is in cannabis besides THC and CBD? And could these compounds maybe work with CBD to make the pain-relieving effects stronger? Because let's be honest, even though CBD has these pain-relieving qualities, it's not going to work as well as some of the stronger opioids that we have heard of, such as morphine or oxycodone. So it turns out there are actually hundreds of other molecules that are found in cannabis. And some of these chemicals, which are called terpenes, they only make up about 1% to 2% of all of cannabis, and they're what is responsible for the different aromas and flavors of different, strains of cannabis. And they're not only found in cannabis, though. They're actually found all over the plant kingdom, and they're an entire group of molecules. So if you zested a lemon, diffused lavender, walked through the woods and smelled the pine trees, or got some black pepper in your nose when you're cooking, you've smelled terpenes before. And not only do they have strong smells, but we know a lot of them already have some therapeutic indications, which is exciting, such as anti-inflammation and pain relief. And even though they only make up a super small amount of the total makeup of cannabis, it's thought that they can play this role in pain relief via what has kind of been coined the entourage effect, where combining CBD with terpenes or combining multiple terpenes together may lead to a greater effect than each of them on their own. And so this has been kind of known for years by word of mouth, people claiming that, whole plant cannabis, it works more effectively than THC or CBD isolates on their own. And the research is still catching up, but has kind of supported those conclusions as well. And so where these terpenes act within our bodies and the effect that they have on pain is a really exciting area of research and what I am involved with currently. And so to give one example, one of the terpenes that I'm studying is called BCP. So it is found in cannabis and black pepper. And we know that this terpene binds to CB1 sister, the CB2 receptor, but when BCP binds to CB2, you don't get those psychoactive effects the same way that you would through the CB1 receptor, which means that people can experience pain relief and anti-inflammation without the feeling of being high. And additionally, the best part is that it also doesn't seem to be having it has a low potential for abuse, which is good as compared to opioids. And so the goal for this kind of research is to find out which specific chemicals have analgesic properties, such as BCP, if the chemicals interact with each other, as we're seeing potentially with CBD and terpenes, which receptors in our brain and body that they act on, and find out if they have any addictive properties so that we can lower risk of abuse. And so this will hopefully allow us to give people lower doses of drugs in general for treating chronic pain, and also uncover more about the endocannabinoid system in general as we uncover new receptors that these drugs might be acting on, and how the endocannabinoid system might communicate with other systems in our body. And so if we think about how we experience kind of the rich sensory world around us, and how in pain those sensations can kind of go awry for millions of individuals experiencing chronic pain, this is a super exciting area of study, especially for me. I'm not suggesting that if you do suffer from chronic pain, that cannabis is the answer, but instead keep your eyes on the research and know that there's hope for finding more non-addictive treatments and also alleviating the opioid epidemic. Thank you.
All right. For our second speaker is Samantha Borje, a molecular engineering graduate student in the University of Washington, and her research focuses on designing massive networks of DNA pieces, which she aims to use as diagnostic platforms for detecting disease. So please welcome Samantha.
Hi, thank you all for coming. No one is going to be getting high in my presentation, but I hope it's still going to be a good time. Today, I want to talk to you all about relationships. And I want to start by talking about my best friend, Jimin. Now, Jimin lives in Gwangju in South Korea. They spend most of their time drawing fan art for Korean manga and writing Naruto fanfiction. They've also gotten really into felting recently. That's a little dinosaur that they made. Jimin also has a rare form of cancer called myelofibrosis, a blood cancer that starts in the bone. Now, myelofibrosis is a painful disease for many reasons, not the least of which is that detecting the disease and keeping track of its progress can involve some incredibly painful procedures. The other day, Jimin was telling me about something called a bone marrow extraction, where a thick needle is driven deep into the bone, and the doctor spends up to 2 hours extracting its contents. Now, Jimin and I have been close friends for about 6 years now, so I can tell you that they never cry. But whenever they sit through this procedure, it's so painful, they tell me they can't help but tear up. Now, Jimin's not alone in this. There are currently over 100 types of cancer around the world that are known to affect humans, and an estimated 18.1 million cancer patients around the world. And the procedures for detecting and tracking cancer are all pretty intense. There are biopsies or surgeries where a piece of your internal organs are cut and removed from your body. There are procedures like bronchoscopies, where a tube is stuck in an uncomfortable part of your body. And there are procedures like MRIs and CT scans, where your body itself is stuck into a big machine for upwards of an hour. These procedures are a lot. They're expensive, they're painful and invasive, they can be time and labor intensive, require a lot of time on behalf of the patient and a lot of labor on behalf of the health professional, and they can require a lot of specialized either equipment or personnel. Now, this is exactly the opposite of what you want for routine testing. Jimin's lucky enough to have access to some of the best care in Seoul, but because of these reasons, testing still gets in the way of their day-to-day life. As an example, the photo that I showed at the beginning of the presentation is actually a pretty old photo, and I was hoping to replace it with a photo of the two of us at a wedding that I attended 2 months ago. But unfortunately, the doctor scheduled some last-minute tests, and they were no longer able to make it. These issues are just exacerbated for low-resource communities and rural areas where they don't have access to the same kind of equipment and care. What you want instead is something that's affordable, something that's non-invasive, something that requires minimal labor and patient time, and something that can be done with the equipment found at general hospitals. Now, a test that I think you might all be familiar with is a COVID-19 PCR test. And this is actually a good example of a test that has all of these features. It's affordable. There are over a dozen testing centers around the city that offer them for free. It's non-invasive. The worst that can happen is you get like a tickle up your nose and like an awkward moment with the person handling your sample. There's minimal labor and patient time. You're in and out of the testing center within 15 minutes, and the health professional doesn't actually have to spend that much time handling your sample. And the PCR machines that you see over there can be found at any general hospital, or most general hospitals. So what's stopping us from using PCR tests to detect cancer? There's a bunch of reasons. The first of which is that for COVID, you're looking for just one molecule, one red flag to tell you whether or not you have it. For COVID, if you have the molecule in your sample, then you have COVID. And if you don't, then you don't. It's fairly simple. Also, for COVID, most infections are relatively short-term. You're not having to keep track of its progress over long periods of time. By contrast, with cancer, you have up to thousands of molecules that you have to consider, and you have to take into account their amounts and how their amounts all relate to each other. The same equipment that we use for COVID-19 PCR tests can't currently process this kind of information. Instead of a diagnosis, you get a shrug. Additionally, most cancers progress in any number of ways, and you have to keep checking back with the patient over months, if not years. So what's missing? How do we get from a shrug to a diagnosis? Well, the answer that I've been working on recently is something called DNA computing. And before I introduce DNA computing, let me introduce DNA. DNA, in popular culture, is used as a sort of a catch-all phrase, right, for the genetic material that makes your body turn out the certain way, or for the more poetically inclined, makes us who we are. You might be familiar with things like Ancestry.com or 23andMe, and you might be familiar with songs like Truth Hurts by Lizzo. In reality, what these testing services and my queen is referring to is the genome. And you can think of the genome like a book of fairy tales, a book that cells read from their infancy to learn how to behave. The DNA is just the alphabet that book is written in. And so the words and sentences that are found in the genome, those are genes. Those are the sentences that are found in the book of fairy tales. With DNA, there are actually only 4 letters as opposed to 26. And because of this, we've gotten really good at creating DNA pieces from scratch, called synthetic DNA. This is the equivalent of writing words and sentences that aren't found in the fairy tale canon. And I work exclusively with these DNA pieces. I'm like a producer on one of those like god-awful dating shows. Like I get these pieces to get together, I get them to break up, and I get them to get into some weird drama with each other. Now, how do I do this? Do I understand how relationships work? Absolutely not. I do not understand most people, and the concept of dating deeply stresses me out. Case in point, my friendship with Jimin. I could not tell you why we're friends. I mentioned earlier that they spend most of their time writing Naruto fanfiction. I've never seen an episode. I do this for a living. They haven't taken a science class in upwards of a decade. They live in Gwangju, I'm from Hong Kong. Neither of us have ever been in each other's home countries or speak the other's mother tongue, yet they are my best friend in the world. Someone who might have a better idea of how relationships work is another Jimin, and that's Jimin from international K-pop sensation BTS. BTS has a song called DNA, and in it they have lyrics that read, "None of this is a coincidence, and our meeting is like a mathematical formula." And if you subscribe to the BTS school of thought, you might remember these love calculators from middle school, where you can put in your name, you can put in the name of your friend, crush, or soulmate, you can press calculate, It'll run through some very complex algorithms, and you'll get a compatibility score. We're planning a June wedding. Now, someone else will have to come in and explain to you the rigorous math and very real math behind these love calculators, but I merely work with DNA. And it turns out that you can actually run my DNA pieces through this exact process. And the reason, now you'll notice that my synthetic DNA pieces look a little bit different from the DNA in the corner or in the genome. My DNA pieces are single strings, but the DNA in the corner and the genome are two strings linked together and coiled around each other to form a kind of twisted ladder. And if we zoom in on this ladder, you'll notice that the rungs, instead of rungs, are actually bases. And these are the letters of the DNA alphabet that I mentioned earlier. And if you look even closer, you'll realize that these bases like to pair up. This twisted ladder is DNA in its most stable form. DNA likes to pair up. It's romantic like that. And that's because bases like to pair up too. Because of the way that they're shaped, an A on one string will only ever bind with a T on another, and a C on one string will only ever connect with a G on another. And so you can tell from the pieces or the combinations or sequences of these letters in each piece whether or not it's going to connect with another piece of DNA. Now let's zoom in on my pieces. And so with that in mind, we can tell from the combinations of letters that these two are going to end up together because their pieces are all perfectly matched, and this one is going to end up alone. And now this is only for 2 or 3 DNA pieces. To explain what happens when there's whole bulks of DNA or other molecules, like in a DNA sample, I'd like you all to imagine this scenario. Let's say you're at a mixer. With your friend, let's call him Adam. Now you and Adam, you bond over a few things, you're very complementary, so you stick together for most of the mixer. But then, a friend of Adam's, who you don't know, starts talking to him. You and this friend, you don't really have much in common, you can't really form a connection, and so as they start talking, you start to phase out of the conversation. And they keep talking, you can't find your way back in, so eventually you bow out, either to join another conversation or to go home. Now, what just happened can be described using a simple equation. You and Adam plus this rando equals Adam and rando plus you alone. And that's exactly like a form of DNA computing. You have 2 pieces of DNA, say the U piece and the Adam piece, that are initially connected. In comes the rando piece, connecting with a part of Adam that the U piece can't access. Eventually, the rando piece and the Adam piece are completely connected, and the U piece leaves the system. Now, let's take it a step further. Let's say at this mixer, everyone is equally awkward. Nobody can talk to more than one person. Nobody's very personable. Everybody's a little bit shy. Like, let's say you're at a mixer in Seattle. All of these kind of situations where people come in and people phase out are happening all over the party, setting each other off, and like dominoes. Now, if I was at a party, with you, and I looked at 2 people, and I told you that I knew 100% that within 14 minutes of these 2 showing up, those 2 people were going to leave, despite the 4 of them being strangers. And if I told you that I knew the exact movements and changes in conversations that were going to happen in the party in order for this to happen, you would look at me like there was something wrong with me, and you'd be right. But because of everything that we just talked about, you can actually do this with the DNA pieces. You can set up entire DNA pieces and know for sure that if the orange ones come in, the blue and the reds come out. Now, in Shanghai, specifically the Institute of Molecular Medicine, they actually use this to create a simple cancer diagnostic platform. They have these sets of DNA pieces in the tube there, and they took the molecules, and if the pieces recognize the molecules as associated with cancer, the sets of DNA would release a red piece, and if they weren't associated with cancer, they would release a blue piece. And it worked okay. There were a bunch of false positives and a bunch of false negatives. And the reason for this is that I mentioned earlier that cancer has up to thousands of associated molecules, whereas the system that we can create right now can only take up to maybe a dozen. And so we're still a long way to go before we can get a cancer COVID PCR test. My job is to create systems that can take up to dozens or hundreds or thousands of pieces of DNA. The current state of the art, we can have DNA department mixers. I'm trying to make DNA BTS concerts. That's a lot of people. And so we're still a long way to go. And I'm going to be spending the next few years in my grad school trying to figure this out. But I'm hoping that once we get there, G-men will have an easier time at the hospital, low-resource communities will have access to better care, and last but not least, G-men will make it to my wedding, whichever one. Thank you. Thank you.
All right, thank you, Sam, for a very entertaining talk. Last but not least, we have Sonya Jampel. She is a master's in public health student in epidemiology at the University of Washington, and she uses large birth and death certificate data sets to analyze the relationships between air pollution and infant mortality in order to inform policy and prevention solutions. So please welcome Sonya.
Okay, thank you everyone for coming today. I'm excited to share with you my work in progress master's thesis, Tiny but Mighty, the Effect of Fine Particulate Matter on Infant Death. So what's the issue? I'd like you to think back to a time when you experienced poor air quality. Think about how your body felt. How you knew if it was safe to go outside. And think about maybe what we can do about poor air quality. These are good questions to be considering because this is something that we're experiencing here in Seattle. For a brief time in October this fall, Seattle had the worst air quality in the world. So hopefully throughout this presentation, you'll learn a little bit about air pollution and think some more about these questions. So wildfires are one source of air pollution. This is a natural source of air pollution along with volcanic eruptions. Another source of air pollution is stationary sources. This is a picture of the Duwamish River, and you can see emissions from metal and glass processing plants as well as cement processing plants. And there can be other power plants, sewage treatment facilities, and industry sites that would be considered stationary sources. Next, you have area sources. This is emission from a large area, so numerous wood-burning stoves, cities in general, and agricultural practices. Lastly, we have mobile sources. Think cars, trucks, buses, airplanes, things that move. So all of these four sources contribute to our air quality, and in 1970, Congress was really concerned. So they passed something called the Clean Air Act. And this requires that the Environmental Protection Agency set national ambient air quality standards. What this means is that there are 6 what we call criteria pollutants. Because of the regulations are based on the negative effects of health pollution, negative effects to human health and environment to set permissible or allowable levels. So we need to set certain criteria for these pollutants. So you might recognize some of these. We have sulfur dioxide, nitrogen dioxide, carbon monoxide, ozone, lead, and particulate matter. Our top 5 you might recognize from high school chemistry class. We have their chemical formulas up there. But I'm going to be talking about our last one, particulate matter. are tiny but mighty particles. So how tiny are they? Particulate matter, we have particulate matter 10 and particulate matter 2.5. I study PM 2.5 microns, and so that's 1/1000th of a millimeter. That's tiny. These are not visible to the naked eye individually, and at least 20 of them can fit across a single human hair. So we got the tiny part. What are they made of? It's a mixture of solids and liquids suspended in the air. So combustion particles, dust, organic compounds, metals. So they can be made up a whole lot of things. Instead, they're characterized based on their size. So they're tiny, but let's take a look at the mighty effects. So fine particulate matter, or PM 2.5, can have serious health effects. Because of their small size, they can enter into the respiratory tract and then penetrate deep into the lungs and then go into other organ systems. They can exacerbate pre-existing health conditions or create new ones. So some of the health effects would be irritation to the lungs, respiratory illnesses like asthma, cardiovascular illnesses, and in most extreme cases, premature death. So the effects range from moderate to severe, and these can have economic effects as well. Doctor's visits, school and work days missed, and ER and hospital visits. So because of these effects, we need to have all different levels of prevention working together. So we have individual level interventions all the way to community level interventions. So an individual level intervention might be going to the doctor's office. If you're feeling like you have effects of asthma due to increased exposure to air pollution, they might prescribe you an inhaler to treat the symptoms. In the middle, we have preventative effects. So the preventative treatment. So you might give someone a mask who works near roadways because of their high exposure. So you lowering the exposure. And lastly, we have community effects. So this is stopping the exposure from the start. You might look to change policy or lower emissions from any of those 4 pollution sources that we had before. I study public health, which is the well-being of people, and communities where we live, learn, work, and play. So only about 20% of health outcomes can be determined in the clinic at that top individual level. And the rest is outside of the clinic for those individuals and then at the community level. So we need experts working at all these levels, but I'm working here at the community level. And I'm interested in taking a look at what are some other effects of fine particulate matter. In particular, I'm interested in the effect on infant death. This is a really serious outcome that we don't know very much about. Infants aren't just tiny adults because they have their own special developmental factors inside the womb and outside the womb that fine particulate matter might influence. So who works on this issue? We need all sorts of experts working together. We need toxicologists, atmospheric scientists, clinicians, and epidemiologists. That's where I come in. Epidemiologists, or what I like to call disease detectives. We investigate the patterns and causes of diseases in a population. You might have heard of this on the news during COVID-19 when epidemiologists were talking about flattening the curve. This is really important work, but epidemiologists can do all sorts of things. I study environmental exposures, other epidemiologists study chronic diseases or wealth and health and the effects of class, or even gun violence. The key is we use similar investigative processes like data analysis, study design, big picture thinking, and communication. As epidemiologists, we use big data sets to answer questions. So when thinking about these serious questions in society, it's important that we consider our positionality, or the ways that differences in social position and power shape identities and access in society. So what that means is, as an educated white woman from a privileged background who hasn't lost a child or even been pregnant, this affects how I conduct my work. Infant mortality has the largest impact on poorer communities and communities of color, and I don't share these identities and haven't experienced infant mortality myself. So this influences how I conduct my work. We're going to be discussing infant mortality the rest of this presentation and should be aware of the severity of these experiences and proceed with respect. So what can a master's student do? I work with something called the North Carolina Birth Cohort. This is all the births and deaths in the state of North Carolina from 2003 to 2015. On the left, we have a picture of a birth certificate, and I'm really excited about this data set because it is quite large and has exact address location. So let's take a look. Here is Husky Stadium. 70,000 people can fit in Husky Stadium. My birth cohort is 18 times that amount. It's 1.3 million births. So we can use large data sets like this to answer big health questions. In epidemiology, we think of our relationships between exposures and outcomes and see if we can find an association to hit at possible causes. For my outcome, I'm looking at infant mortality within the first year of life. We use something called a case control study design. Hang with me. So cases are infants who die within the first year of life, and controls are infants who don't. We then go back and assess air pollution exposure. The key with this study design is that we look at the outcome first. We then, our exposure is fine particulate matter. So remember I talked about those point address locations? That's key because we only have monitors in a few sites in each county. And so we have to use computer systems that put in temperature, humidity, emissions, air pollution levels to predict the exposure at these exact places. And that's going to help us have a more accurate estimate. And so the reason why I went so deep into this study design is because epidemiologists find this really important to craft methods to best answer their questions as detectives. I also take a look at critical periods of exposure. The question here is, when is it most detrimental to be exposed to air pollution? And this will inform what we do with policy. So is it most detrimental to be exposed in trimester 1, 2, 3, etc.? So when looking at this association, we have to deal with something called confounders. Confounders are associated with the exposure and the outcome. In my study, I look at confounders like maternal age, education, neighborhood, prenatal care, marital status, diabetes, and race, ethnicity, to name a few. So let's look at this idea of confounders a little more. So I love ice cream. And they found that when a community eats more ice cream, there's also higher rates of drowning. That should seem a little confusing. Those don't seem to be related. But that's because they're associated, but I don't really think it's causal because something else is going on. There might be a confounder we're not considering. Temperature. So when it's hotter out, people like to eat more ice cream. And also when it's hotter out, people like to swim more, and then that leads to higher rates of drowning. So if we adjust for this confounder, we no longer see an association, thank goodness, between eating ice cream and drowning. That would be an issue for me because I love ice cream. So how does that apply here? So let's look at education. Education might be associated with the exposure because birthing parents with higher education might be likely to have a better job and be able to afford to live somewhere farther from a roadway. Birthing parents with higher education might have that better job that will allow them to take time off of work if they have birth complications, leading higher education to have a negative effect on infant mortality. So more highly educated, less likely to experience infant mortality. So if we adjust for education, we can then take a look at the true relationship between exposure and outcome and see if education is acting like temperature was in our previous example. Further down the study, we might decide to look at the effect of education, but initially we want to adjust for it so we can look at specifically between the fine particulate matter and the infant mortality. So my preliminary results show that there is an association, but after I adjust for those confounders, it's looking like there no longer is. So my work until I graduate is to figure out what's going on there and which confounders are doing which confounders are acting like temperature in our previous example. So how do we set these standards for healthy limits of exposure based on the science research? AKA, how can my science actually make a difference? I'm working here on scientific studies on health and the environmental effects. I'm studying infant mortality because there isn't much research done on this yet. After the work is finished, it goes through peer review where experts review the work and make sure it's scientifically sound. Then the Congress mandated that every 5 years, all 6 criteria pollutants are reviewed and an integrated science assessment is created by the EPA. So they compile all of the research, and then it's reviewed by experts in the public, and then the EPA will put out a proposed decision for what levels are safe. After the proposed decision, there'll be public hearings and comments, and then a final decision. So you can see that there are 3 steps here that have input from experts in the public, which is really important because we want to have confidence in our science. So this is happening right now. The EPA proposed lowering the concentration that's allowed for fine particulate matter, that which I am studying. My research didn't make it into that review because this just came out in January, but hopefully in 5 years it will. So this regulation is expected to prevent 4,200 premature deaths annually, save $43 billion, and prevent 270,000 lost workdays. This is a big deal. So during wildfire season, you might remember taking out your phone and checking the air quality index to see if it was safe to go outside. The air quality index is actually an indicator of the concentration of this tiny but mighty particle, PM 2.5. So the proposed regulation decreases the concentration of particulate matter that would fall in the green range. Basically what that means is there'd be a lower threshold for safe exposure if this regulation were to be accepted. So now for the good news. This process seems to be working. In 2000, the level of PM 2.5 in the atmosphere was much higher than it is right now. Our most recent data is in 2020. So the current level, the current national standard is 12 micrograms, per meter cubed, and the proposed standard is a little bit lower. So let's see what this would do. There are certain areas in the US highlighted in green that wouldn't meet this new standard. So the EPA would work with states to figure out plans to reduce these levels. So it's pretty difficult to reduce in the short term through regulations, natural sources. So our best bets are to work with states to limit air pollution exposure for these other 3 sources. So the EPA might work with states to reduce emissions from power plants. They might work to help create a plan to replace wood-burning stoves with electric stoves. Or they might work with vehicle companies to help reduce emissions from vehicles. So in January, the EPA released a proposed decision for fine particulate matter. In March, there were public hearings and comments. And now we are waiting for the final decision. So this is very exciting. So we learned about the importance of how science informs policy and how peer review is really important. So while it's too late to submit a comment, you can read the comments here and look at how citizens and scientists work together to review this proposed regulation. I'm working at the final step, the community level of prevention, but we need individuals working at all of those levels to help address the health effects of fine particulate matter. I'm really excited to see air quality improve and start to address issues of climate and health equity in my work. I'd like to take a moment to thank my thesis committee, thanks my friends and family for listening to me practice, thank Nicole and my classmates for helping me through learning about science communication. and all of you for coming. So I'm happy to take any questions at the end.
All right. Okay. Thank you for your patience. This is our Q&A session, which will go until about 7-ish, assuming that everybody has lots of questions to ask our lovely speakers. If you do have a question, please come up to the mic so that we can get the audio picked up. And yeah, just feel free to come up and let us know what you're curious about. We're hoping to answer all of your curiosities in the next 30 minutes. If we talk loudly, do we need to go up? I will ask the back of the room. If they talk loudly, do they need to go up to the mic? We need the microphone. We need the microphone. Please don't be embarrassed. Please come up to the microphone. Please do ask. Yes, okay.
Speaking of the pieces of DNA that you're trying to pick out of a mixture, what size strands of probes are you putting in there, and how specific are they for cancer, for specific cancer?
Yeah, so right now, the study that I mentioned tested for lung cancer, and so there aren't really ways to distinguish between cancers, just because also the molecular basis behind cancers is also like a question that other researchers are working on, right? But the probes that I build are about up to 200 nucleotides long. You use strands, I'm assuming you know what nucleotides are. And they can sort of take up to, right now, up to like 3 inputs each probe. And the way that I build my circuits is that I put all of these probes sort of together, so more like 3 by 3 or whatever can be taken in. Thanks for your question.
A similar twist on the same question. I know that my DNA is different than your DNA. Is my cancer DNA the same as your cancer DNA? So when you're probing for cancer DNA, or is cancer DNA always the same for the different?
That's an excellent question. I think right now the main ways that people detect cancer is sort of how different it is from normal DNA or healthy DNA. So even if our cancer DNAs are different, it's just sort of, they look for certain spots along your DNA to see whether or not they've sort of diverged from the normal. Again, this is research that other really smart people are working on.
Thank you, everyone, for your great presentation. What were some of the processes of making these presentations for a lay audience? Like, what were some of the challenges, and what was fun about kind of putting that complicated work into easy to understand language?
Anyone can start.
I can go first. I think the most fun part was kind of like putting, I don't know, like the story behind it, kind of making it hopefully entertaining in comparison, to a lot of like the very like science rigorous talks we go to are not always the most like entertaining to go to. So it was kind of fun like finding a way to do that. And also kind of getting back to the bigger picture idea of like why we're doing this research in the first place, because I think a lot of times if you get too down in the nitty-gritty, that gets lost sometimes.
I think it was really exciting to work together as a class and meet other grad students who were studying science, but not exactly the science you were studying. So it was a good sounding board for people like to float an idea and see what they thought. And so we did a lot of practice about starting with something interesting. I think that was like a key takeaway for me. A lot of scientific articles follow a and presentations follow a structure of like introduction, methods, results, conclusion. And so we talked a lot about the importance of putting your more exciting thing at the front so that you would catch people's attention, and how writing or presenting for the general public might even follow a different format in addition to having simple and clear language. So it's not just about what language you use, it's also about how you tell the story. So that was kind of new for me.
Yeah, it was really great collaborating with our classmates. At a certain point, we were put in this sort of conference room, and it felt like we were in like a little writer's room for a show. That was exciting. I mean, my research isn't exactly personable, so it was nice to be able to relate it to sort of the lay audience, or to relate it back to, for example, my friend or to Trevor Noah. It was just make things a lot more entertaining because, as you can imagine, research itself is a lot of like hours kind of alone and like on your little test tubes, and so it's nice to sort of bring back a social aspect to it.
Yeah, it's also like really exciting to see how everybody's stories develop over time, and how, you know, they are able to take the feedback from their classmates and change the stories. I don't know why I'm losing my voice. I wasn't the one talking tonight. Yeah, it was really great to work with y'all, so thank you. I'm sorry if that question also felt like a quiz with me sitting next to you. Yeah.
This question's for Kaylin, and it's about the getting research money while studying cannabis. And I don't know if that's like still a prohibition, but if that's been a complication in your research and how you've navigated that.
Yeah, that's a good question. It gets a little bit more complicated. So the research that I'm mostly doing is non-THC research. So that's like kind of a whole other like can of worms, since THC is still like a Schedule I substance. And so there are a lot of hurdles to cross, you know, for getting approval to use it in the lab, and things like that. And CBD was recently, a couple years ago, so before I think I joined the lab that I'm in now, recently descheduled. So it's become a lot easier to research those things. And terpenes are, again, unscheduled as well. And so, so that has a lot to do with it, whether the drug is scheduled or not. And then as far as like getting funding, the NIH is one of the largest funding sources that is available, and they do have initiatives now that do specifically. It is mostly targeted towards non-THC or non-opioid kind of pain treatments, and so that's kind of, again, shapes the way that we do the research. Yeah. I guess, does that answer your question?
I'll check my vocabulary first. Nociceptor, is that so 2 questions about the nociceptor. Is when you get a burn or something and it's on your skin, same type of receptor that's like deep down inside when your bones and muscles are tired? And is it the same system that sends the pleasure signals when you pet a kitten? Is that your nociceptors also, or is there like pleasure receptors as well as pain receptors?
So that's a really good question. So nociceptors are pretty specific to a painful stimulus, and like within nociceptors there are like a lot of different kinds. So something that you like when you eat a spicy pepper, let's say, you get that really like hot sensation. That's a different receptor versus if you are touching like an ice cube for too long versus, other types of pain, I guess, or if you stub your toe. So those are nociceptors, and I would say they are, some are the same and some are different, that are also found in our brains, I guess. There's like a lot of communication between receptor types, I guess. Like it will send like a chemical cascade that will go on to activate different receptors for different chemicals and things like that. And could you repeat the second part of your question, or did I answer that as well?
Yeah, I think that
and the pleasure receptors.
The pleasure receptor is just a nociceptor sending a different message.
Yeah, it would be called something else. So we do have receptors for different types of, I guess, textures and things like that. But in that case, it wouldn't be a nociceptor. It would be, a different kind of mechanoreceptor or something of that sort.
Hi, everyone. I know what two of you do in your day-to-day life, but I would love to hear from all three of you kind of what your day-to-day day in the lab looks like. I know that that's super different across all disciplines, so I'd love to hear more what your research looks like in practice.
I can go first. Piper knows a little bit about what I do, but a lot of epidemiology research, it can look like a lot of different things, but my work in particular, I have large data sets on the computer, and then I'm coding in R. So what that means is you clean the data and make sure all the variables, like if it says that the mother is 30, it says that in all the same ways. So it says 30 instead of it's being spelled out, instead of it having spaces. So you have to make sure all the variables look the same, and then you're running different statistical tests to look at associations. And so this work is also done in collaboration with the Environmental Protection Agency. So I'm working at the University of Washington as well as at the Environmental Protection Agency. And then it gets written up in a paper. So no wet lab is the answer.
Yeah, it totally depends on the day and the experiments. So in the lab that I'm in, we use rodent models a lot, so it's a lot of animal work. When I do collect the data, we do a lot of imaging experiments, and so those are very large data sets. So after I've collected the data, a lot of it's data analysis, so spending time coding, going through the large data sets to kind of get the results. After that part, there can be a lot of writing involved, writing up the research, doing also a lot of presentations for different lab meetings and things, kind of communicating the results that I'm finding to my advisors and fellow lab mates. So kind of a mix of wet lab, computer work, communicating.
Yeah, mine's also a bit of a mix. To design my circuits, I sort of use these programs that luckily other people have made, and I sort of spend a lot of time staring at a screen to see whether or not my designs would work in a simulation. And then I go into the wet lab where I put tiny transparent liquids into other tiny transparent liquids for just like hours. I do like my job, but there's also a lot of like communicating because again, like tiny molecules. I'm actually working on a conference submission tonight that's due at 5 a.m. So we'll see.
Hello, I have a question about the particulate matter. I used to work in the atmospheric science department of UW, and I learned a lot about microplastics that go in the ocean and turtles like eat them and die. Is that the same thing, just as in the air particles?
I don't know that much about microplastics, but my understanding is they're small particles of plastic that you can't really see that go in and have health effects. And so by that definition, I would say that fine particulate matter is pretty similar. I think maybe a difference is the plastics are just made of plastic, whereas these can be made of all sorts of different things. And I think that the plastics probably have a longer life, some of them. That's what we're learning about a lot of these plastics is the issue is that they stay in the environment for a long time. And definitely some of fine particulate matter would stay in the environment from a long time, but some of the issue is that it's like suspended in the air, but in the ground it wouldn't necessarily have as big of an effect.
Thank you.
Great job to all of you. Sonya, I have a question. Why did you choose to focus on PM 2.5 versus the other components of air pollution? And also, moving forward, could you look at PM 2.5 in combination with the other air pollutants as like a combined outcome variable?
Yeah, so I chose to look at PM 2.5 or fine particulate matter because this is something that we're just starting to study a little bit more. So there's different types of particulate matter based on size. So there's PM10, PM2, which is 10 microns, PM2.5, which is 2.5 microns, and now people are starting to study PM1, which is ultrafine particles, which is 1 micron, and there's very little research on that. The reason why there's more research on things like PM10 is because it was easier to measure concentrations initially. So we didn't have some of those measurement tools before that allowed us to measure these ultrafine and fine particulate matter. There are people studying the other criteria pollutants. Some of them have more work than others. The work on lead has been really seminal in improving health. Levels of lead have decreased a lot, but we're still doing a lot of work on it. So there's different there's been some work on some criteria pollutants more than others. This was the one that my lab was studying that I was interested in joining. But definitely multi-pollutant models are something that we need to look at. Often it's looked along with sulfur dioxide. A lot of them model those together because something that we're realizing is that a lot of the regulations that were written in the 70s and 80s were for singular pollutants or singular exposures because that's way easier to study. But that's not how life works. And so in science, we like to isolate effects, but then in the real world, you want to know what's going to happen. So there are definitely multi-pollutants that are happening, multi-pollutant models, but that would be more of a dissertation. And
Stay for 3 more years.
There's also this new, I don't know how new it is, but in 2005 maybe, the concept of the exposome, which is all the environmental exposures. So you wouldn't just be looking at air pollution. You would be also looking at plastics, and you'd be looking at, oh my goodness. You'd be looking like all different factors that might influence your health together. So carcinogenic materials and stuff like that too.
Thank you all for your patience with me. This one I think is easy. How on earth from a birth certificate do you determine educational level? Does North Carolina record that?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. They don't hear.
But it does, like, we found that it was recorded differently in different years of the birth certificate. So I was lucky to have someone do that cleaning for me. So right now it's coded as less than high school, and more than high school, because that's the lowest level in common, but some of the birth certificates said like college, greater than college, and had that information too. So definitely changes in the way that we collect data is really important. And so sometimes we change things like birth certificates because we want to make more categories, we want to be more specific. But then when you're looking at comparing data between years, that can be an issue.
Another Sonya death certificate question. I'm guessing you got this data set from somebody who already like had permission to use it, but how do you convince someone to give you all this like private personal information and like assure them it's going to be like on a saved secure computer so that you can work on it for a year?
Yeah, so we want to make sure that we're not getting personally identified health information out onto the internet. That's really important. Especially because we have these exact address locations. So my collaborator at the EPA submitted something called an IRB, an institutional review board, submitted a document to the institutional review board, so we call the IRB, and they got all the birth and death certificates from 2003 to 2015. So this is called the North Carolina Birth Cohort, and they have lots of different papers published on it. So you can take a look at other research that has been done with this. So they look at other outcomes like low birth weight and preterm birth and birth defects, and they can look at different exposures. So the lab mostly looks at air pollution, but you could imagine you could look at racial segregation by census tract. You could look at urban versus rural and all different effects on health. So I had to apply to the University of Washington IRB to get my own permission to use this data set that's already being used. And then I have to use a remote desktop, so I'm not saving the data directly to my computer where someone could just take it, but it lives like kind of in the ether, and I log on and get access to it. So there's secure protocols to make sure we're protecting health information. But they're applying for 2016 to 2020, I think, and they should get that soon.
So how reusable is all this like clean data that you've used? Like if other researchers, like the ones you mentioned, like on racial segregation or stuff, like all the work you've done in making this data set usable and like understandable and like something you could use in R, could other researchers reuse that work? Is there a way to share those data sets so that other researchers don't have to data clean again?
Yeah, so I think luckily a lot of the cleaning was done for me. So that would have been a lot more work if I had to clean all the variables. So that was done by other PhD and postdoc and PIs in the lab. So they were able to share it with me. So if someone else wanted to use it, they could talk to the lab who has it and talk about sharing and maybe submit their own IRB. And I had to do some data cleaning, like to make the analysis runnable for me, like separating the year from the month, from the date to calculate the different critical periods of exposure, the trimesters. But yeah, we don't really want to have all the scientists have to repeat the same process over and over. From a different lab, I think they might have to clean it themselves, but I'm not sure.
This question is for Samantha, and it's kind of like two pieces.
Okay.
The first part is when you're talking about like that you put the input in it, all the changes come down.
Right.
With healthy people that don't have like cancer, is that always the same? Like, can you reliably say like if you put this into it, it'll always come out with the same output?
That's the idea, but most of the time, or some of the time, it doesn't work sort of as designed. Yeah.
And then the other question is, can you add more than one input at the same time?
Yeah, that's sort of what I'm working on. And so, like, it was actually sort of a novel thing that the institute in Shanghai was working on, that they could take up to 4 sort of molecules in a medical sample, and I'm trying to sort of scale it up to make it more dozens or hundreds, if not thousands. Yeah.
I also have a question for Sonya. What's your favorite kind of ice cream?
This is really important because our first speaker told us that her favorite milkshake was mint chocolate chip. So this would be our second strong stance on a dessert flavor.
I really like fish food, Ben & Jerry's.
Okay.
Fish food?
Look, people haven't heard of this.
I'm from the East Coast.
For the clarification.
So it's named after the band Fish, Phish, and it has chocolate fish in it.
Okay.
I don't think I would like salmon ice cream.
I'm just suggesting that we take one more question because we have a crowd waiting to get in for the next program.
Okay.
Okay, I have a question, but I don't remember the exact technical term that you're studying within the cannabis. Can you remind me? Like the key that you're studying?
Like THC or terpenes?
Terpenes, thank you, it's T. So when thinking about using terpenes to fight against chronic pain or like reduce the sensation of chronic pain, how have you thought about like how that would also maybe induce sleepiness or drowsiness or fatigue, and like how do you separate those, or do terpenes just not induce those side effects?
Yeah, I mean, that's something we're constantly thinking about, honestly, when we're thinking about, off-target effects of drugs. Ideally, we would want something that is very specific to the thing that we want to treat, like chronic pain, without any other side effects. But, because of the system that we're targeting and that the endocannabinoid system is involved in, sleep and appetite and these things, it's going to be hard to disentangle the specificity of the effects we want versus the side effects that they have. And hopefully, we're not choosing drugs that have severe side effects such as opioids and things like that. So definitely something we're thinking about, but it is always very complicated.
All right. Thank you all again for joining us tonight, and thank you for all of the excellent questions. We'd love to invite you back to our next event in this Engage Science Now series, which is on Monday, May 15th, starting at 5:30 back here. Additionally, if you want to learn more about Engage, feel free to come and chat with me. You can visit our website, which is engage-science.space, or follow us on Instagram and Twitter at Engage Science. And if you're a graduate student and you're excited about learning more about science communication, please consider applying for this course next year. The applications typically open in November. So thank you all again so much for coming tonight.